The ocean has always been humanity's most formidable battlefield, vast, unforgiving, and indifferent to human suffering. During World War II, this ancient truth was magnified to unprecedented scale. Between 1939 and 1945, the seas became graveyards for thousands of vessels and hundreds of thousands of souls. While history remembers the naval battles that turned the tide of war, tonight we explore a different aspect of maritime warfare: the catastrophic sinking of vessels carrying civilians, prisoners of war, and military personnel who were not engaged in combat operations. These are not tales of glorious naval engagements or strategic victories. They are stories of human tragedy on a scale difficult to comprehend, moments when the brutal calculus of total war transformed ships into tombs and survivors into unwilling witnesses to history's darkest hours. From the icy Baltic to the shark-infested Pacific, these disasters claimed more lives than many land battles, yet they remain footnotes in our collective memory of the war. As we navigate these treacherous waters of history, we confront uncomfortable questions about military necessity, the rules of war, and the value of human life during humanity's deadliest conflict. These are the forgotten maritime disasters of World War II tragedies that remind us that in war, the greatest casualties are often measured not in territory gained or lost, but in the extinguishing of human potential. In the bitter winter of 1945, as Soviet forces advanced inexorably westward, millions of German civilians and military personnel fled in terror. The Red Army's reputation for brutality had preceded it, fueled by both Nazi propaganda and the very real atrocities committed by some Soviet troops seeking vengeance for Germany's devastating invasion of their homeland. For those trapped in East Prussia, a German territory, now cut off from the rest of the Reich, escape by land was nearly impossible. The only route to safety lay across the Baltic Sea. The German Navy launched Operation Hannibal, the largest maritime evacuation in history. Over the course of just a few months, more than 2 million people would be transported west by a hastily assembled fleet of military vessels, merchant ships, and passenger liners. Among these ships was the Wilhelm Gustloff, a 684-foot luxury cruise liner built before the war as part of the Nazi Strength Through Joy program, designed to provide recreational activities for working-class Germans. Named after a Swiss Nazi leader assassinated in 1936, the Gustloff had been launched by Hitler himself in 1937. The vessel had briefly served as a pleasure cruiser before being converted into a hospital ship and later a floating barracks for submarine trainees. Now, in January 1945, it would serve one final purpose as an escape vessel for desperate refugees. On January 30th, 1945, the Gustloff departed from the port of Gotenhafen, now Gdynia, Poland. Though designed to carry approximately 1,800 passengers and crew, the ship was grotesquely overcrowded. Official records listed 650 people on board, but this did not include hundreds who boarded without documentation. Heinz Schön, a German archivist who survived the sinking, later concluded that the actual number was closer to 10,582, including naval personnel, wounded soldiers, women, children, and elderly refugees. The human density aboard the vessel defied imagination. Every cabin, corridor, and public space was packed with humanity. The ship's swimming pool had been drained and filled with people. Mothers cradled infants in crowded hallways. Children slept in bathtubs. The freezing temperatures outside between 0 and 14 degrees Fahrenheit made conditions on the open decks unbearable, forcing even more people into the overcrowded interior spaces. Captain Friedrich Pedersen faced an impossible situation. The Gustloff had been immobilized for years as a stationary training ship, and 4 of its lifeboats had been removed. Those that remained could accommodate only a small fraction of those aboard. Moreover, the Baltic in January was itself a death sentence. Water temperatures were barely above freezing, promising rapid hypothermia to anyone immersed. At approximately 6 p.m., as the Gustloff made its way through the dark Baltic waters, a message was brought to the captain, warning of a German minesweeper convoy ahead. Petersen made the fateful decision to activate the ship's navigation lights to avoid collision. The origin of this message remains unknown. None of the radio operators claimed to have received it. Whether it was a misunderstanding or perhaps even Soviet disinformation will never be known. What is certain is that the illuminated vessel was spotted by Soviet submarine S-13, commanded by Captain Alexander Marinesco. In a brilliant tactical maneuver, Marinesco positioned his submarine between the Gustloff and the coast, the direction from which an attack would be least expected. At 9:16 p.m., S-13 fired 3 torpedoes. All found their mark. The first torpedo struck the bow, the second hit amidships near the swimming pool packed with refugees, and the third struck the engine room, disabling the ship's power. In an instant, chaos engulfed the vessel. Lights failed, plunging the crowded interior into darkness. The ship listed heavily to starboard. Passengers who had been sleeping were thrown from their beds. Children were separated from parents in the crush of panicked humanity. With power lost, many interior compartments were sealed by electric doors that could no longer be opened. The extreme cold had frozen many of the lifeboats to their davits. Those that could be launched often capsized in the process, dumping their occupants into the freezing Baltic. Within 40 minutes, the Gustloff was lying on its side. 10 minutes later, it slipped beneath the waves. The scene in the water was apocalyptic. Thousands of people, many without life jackets, struggled in the freezing sea. Mothers tried desperately to hold children above water. The fortunate few who reached lifeboats watched as those in the water succumbed to hypothermia within minutes, their cries gradually diminishing as the cold claimed them. German vessels in the area, alerted by distress signals, rushed to the scene. The torpedo boat T-36 rescued 564 people. The torpedo boat Löwe saved 472. Various minesweepers and other vessels picked up a few hundred more. In total, only 1,252 people were rescued. The remaining 9,343 men, women, and children perished, making it the deadliest maritime disaster in history, 6 times more deadly than the sinking of the Titanic. The scale of the tragedy is difficult to comprehend. Entire families vanished. Of the approximately 4,000 children aboard, only a few dozen survived. The loss of life exceeded the combined total of the Titanic and Lusitania disasters. Yet for decades, the sinking remained relatively unknown in the West. Several factors contributed to this historical amnesia. The Nazi regime, in its final months, suppressed news of the disaster to avoid further damaging morale. After the war, Cold War politics made both sides reluctant to discuss the incident. The Soviets because it involved attacking a ship carrying civilians. The Western Allies because it might generate sympathy for German suffering. For the survivors, the trauma was compounded by displacement and the collective guilt many Germans felt after the war for the atrocities of the Nazi regime. The legal and moral questions surrounding the sinking remain complex. Under the rules of war, the Gustloff was a legitimate military target. It was painted in military gray, armed with anti-aircraft guns, and carrying nearly 1,000 naval personnel. Yet the knowledge that thousands of innocent refugees, including children, perished raises profound questions about the ethics of warfare. For Alexander Marinesco, who had no way of knowing the full passenger manifest of the ship he attacked, the sinking was his greatest victory. He had struck a devastating blow against the Nazi regime that had inflicted untold suffering on his homeland. Yet rather than being celebrated as a hero, he was initially denied recognition by Soviet authorities due to his disciplinary problems and was discharged from the Navy in 1945. Only posthumously, in 1990, was he finally named a hero of the Soviet Union. Today, the wreck of the Wilhelm Gustloff lies at the bottom of the Baltic, a mass grave and monument to the largest loss of life in maritime history. Its story serves as a somber reminder of the true cost of war measured, not in territory or ideology, but in human lives cut short and potential forever lost to the cold depths. On September 12, 1942, the British troopship RMS Laconia was sailing alone approximately 950 miles south of Freetown, West Africa. Originally built as a Cunard ocean liner in 1921, the 20,000-ton vessel had been converted for military use at the outbreak of war. On this voyage, she carried an unusual complement: 463 officers and crew, 80 civilians, including women and children, 286 British Army soldiers, 1,793 Italian prisoners of war, and 103 Polish soldiers acting as guards for the prisoners. The Laconia was commanded by Captain Rudolf Sharp, an experienced mariner who had no way of knowing that his ship had been spotted by German submarine U-156 under the command of Korvettenkapitän Werner Hartenstein. At 10:22 p.m., Hartenstein fired 2 torpedoes at what he believed was a legitimate military target. Both torpedoes struck the Laconia, causing catastrophic damage. The ship began listing heavily, and it became immediately apparent that she would sink. What followed was a scene of chaos and, in some cases, brutality. The Italian prisoners had been confined in the cargo holds, and as the ship began to sink, many remained locked below decks. Some managed to break out through ventilation shafts or by forcing hatches. As they attempted to reach the lifeboats, several were reportedly bayoneted or shot by their Polish guards, who were attempting to maintain order and ensure the evacuation of British personnel and civilians first. As survivors entered the water, a new horror awaited. The blood from injuries attracted sharks, which began attacking those struggling in the water. Corporal Dino Monte, one of the few Italian survivors, later recalled, "Sharks darted among us, grabbing an arm, biting a leg. Other larger beasts swallowed entire bodies." The Laconia sank at 11:23 p.m., just over an hour after being torpedoed. What happened next was unprecedented in the history of submarine warfare. As U-156 surfaced to capture senior officers, Hartenstein was shocked to discover the true nature of the Laconia's passenger list. Seeing survivors in the water calling out in Italian, he realized he had sunk a ship carrying Italian prisoners of war, citizens of Germany's Axis ally. Hartenstein immediately began rescue operations, an extraordinary decision for a submarine commander in wartime. He sent a coded message to German naval headquarters: "Sunk by Hartenstein, British Laconia, QFF7721, 310 degree. Unfortunately, with 1,500 Italian POWs, 90 fished out of the water so far. Request orders. Admiral Karl Dönitz, head of the German submarine fleet, responded by ordering 7 U-boats to divert to the area to assist in rescue operations. This decision was countermanded by Adolf Hitler himself, who was furious at the diversion of military assets for humanitarian purposes. However, Dönitz modified his orders, sending 3 submarines, U-156, U-506, and U-507, along with the Italian submarine Capellini, to continue the rescue, while requesting that Vichy French authorities dispatch vessels from Dakar to collect survivors. For the next 3 days, an extraordinary scene unfolded in the mid-Atlantic. German submarines, vessels designed for stealth and killing, became rescue ships. U-156 took aboard approximately 200 survivors, including British military personnel and civilians, and towed lifeboats filled with hundreds more. Hartenstein had a Red Cross flag draped across his submarine's deck gun and broadcast his position and activities on open radio frequencies in English, requesting assistance from any nearby vessels. This humanitarian act, however, would be met with tragedy. On September 16th, an American B-24 Liberator bomber on anti-submarine patrol spotted U-156 on the surface. Despite the Red Cross flag and clear visual evidence of rescue operations, including lifeboats being towed, the aircraft's commander, Lieutenant James D. Harden, requested instructions from his base. The response from Captain Robert C. Richardson III was unequivocal: sink the sub. A British officer aboard the submarine attempted to signal the aircraft, transmitting, "RAF officer, speaking from German submarine, Laconia survivors on board, soldiers, civilians, women, children." The plea was ignored. The B-24 made 4 bombing runs, dropping depth charges that damaged U-156 and killed dozens of survivors in the lifeboats being towed behind the submarine. Hartenstein had no choice but to cast off the lifeboats and dive to escape destruction, abandoning hundreds of survivors he had been attempting to save. The other German submarines, learning of the attack, were similarly forced to submerge or risk destruction, though they continued rescue efforts more cautiously. Eventually, French ships from Dakar arrived and rescued many survivors, but the damage had been done. Of the approximately 2,732 people aboard the Laconia, only between 976 and 1,083 survived. The majority of those who perished were Italian prisoners of war. The incident had profound consequences for the conduct of submarine warfare. On September 17, 1942, Admiral Dönitz issued what became known as the Laconia Order to all U-boat commanders. No attempt of any kind must be made at rescuing members of ships sunk, and this includes picking up persons in the water and putting them in lifeboats, righting capsized lifeboats and handing over food and water. Rescue runs counter to the rudimentary demands of warfare for the destruction of enemy ships and crews. Orders for bringing in captains and chief engineers still apply. Rescue the shipwrecked only if their statements will be of importance to your boat. Be harsh, having in mind that the enemy takes no regard of women and children in his bombing attacks on German cities. This order effectively ended any humanitarian considerations in submarine warfare, leading to what became known as unrestricted submarine warfare. The practice of sinking merchant vessels without warning and without provision for the safety of passengers or crew The American pilots who attacked U-156 reported they had sunk the submarine, though it actually survived, and were awarded medals for bravery. Neither they nor their commander faced any investigation or repercussions for attacking a vessel clearly engaged in humanitarian rescue operations. In a final ironic twist, during the Nuremberg trials after the war, prosecutors attempted to use the Laconia Order as evidence of war crimes committed by Dönitz and the German submarine service. The strategy backfired spectacularly when the full details of the Laconia incident emerged, causing significant embarrassment to the United States. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, even provided an affidavit stating that the U.S. had also practiced unrestricted submarine warfare against Japan from the first day of the war. The Laconia incident stands as one of the war's most morally complex episodes, a moment when humanity briefly transcended the boundaries of war, only to be crushed by the implacable logic of total conflict. For Werner Hartenstein, who would perish with all hands aboard U-156 when it was sunk in March 1943, the incident represented both his finest hour as a human being and his greatest disillusionment as a naval officer. The victims of the Laconia, both those who perished in the initial sinking and those who died when rescue efforts were attacked, remain largely forgotten. Casualties of a war that claimed tens of millions of lives. Their story serves as a reminder that even in humanity's darkest hours, individual acts of compassion can emerge, though they may be fleeting and ultimately futile against the overwhelming tide of conflict. As German forces swept through France in June 1940, hundreds of thousands of Allied troops and civilians found themselves trapped against the Atlantic coast. The evacuation of Dunkirk, which had rescued over 338,000 men from the beaches of northern France, was complete. But tens of thousands more British personnel remained scattered throughout western France. Operation Ariel was launched to evacuate these remaining forces before they could be captured by the rapidly advancing German army. Among the vessels pressed into service for this desperate evacuation was the RMS Lancastria, a 16,243-ton Cunard liner built in 1920 and requisitioned as a troopship at the outbreak of war. On June 17, 1940, the Lancastria anchored in the Loire estuary near the port of Saint-Nazaire, which was already under German air attack. The ship's captain, Rudolf Sharp, had been ordered to take aboard as many troops as possible, disregarding the vessel's normal capacity of 1,300 passengers. Throughout the day, a stream of small boats ferried soldiers and civilians to the Lancastria. Among them were RAF personnel, Army units, and British civilians who had been working in France. By early afternoon, the ship was grotesquely overcrowded. Modern estimates suggest between 4,000 and 7,000 people had crammed aboard. The exact number will never be known. As in the chaos of evacuation, normal embarkation procedures and record-keeping had been abandoned. The scene aboard the Lancastria was one of desperate overcrowding. Men packed the corridors, stairwells, and public spaces. Some sat shoulder to shoulder on open decks under the summer sun. Despite the grim circumstances, morale remained surprisingly high. Survivors later reported that men were singing popular songs like "Roll Out the Barrel" and "There'll Always Be an England" to keep spirits up as they waited for departure. At 3:48 p.m., disaster struck. German Junkers, Ju-88 bombers, having spotted the vulnerable transport, attacked the Lancastria and other vessels in the anchorage. 4 bombs struck the ship in quick succession. One hit near the bridge, another struck the engine room, a third hit near the stern, and a fourth-most catastrophically is believed by some accounts to have gone directly down the ship's funnel, causing a massive internal explosion. The effect was devastating. Compartments that had been packed with men were instantly transformed into charnel houses. The engine room was destroyed, cutting all power to the vessel. Most critically, the bomb that struck near the stern ruptured the ship's fuel bunkers, releasing thousands of gallons of heavy fuel oil into the surrounding water. As the Lancastria began to list heavily to starboard, the situation aboard deteriorated into chaos. The ship carried 16 lifeboats, enough for perhaps 1,500 people, a fraction of those aboard. Many of these boats could not be launched due to the ship's increasing list, or because they had been damaged in the bombing. Those that were successfully lowered were often overcrowded and capsized upon hitting the water. For thousands of men, the only option was to jump into the sea. Many who did so were killed instantly when they struck the water incorrectly from the height of the ship's decks, breaking necks or backs on impact. Others, weighed down by equipment or unable to swim, drowned immediately. Those who survived the initial plunge faced new horrors. The fuel oil that had spilled from the ship's ruptured tanks spread across the water's surface, creating a thick, viscous layer that coated swimmers, filled mouths and nostrils, and made it nearly impossible to stay afloat. Survivors described the nightmarish experience of trying to swim through the heavy oil, which clung to their bodies and dragged them down. Then came perhaps the most horrific aspect of the disaster. German aircraft returned and began strafing the oil-covered water with machine gun fire. The bullets ignited the floating fuel, creating a sea of flame that consumed hundreds of oil-coated survivors. Men who had survived the sinking now found themselves having to choose between drowning, burning, or being shot. Just 20 minutes after being hit, the Lancastria rolled onto her side and sank. As she did so, hundreds of men who had gathered on her upturned hull were thrown into the water. Survivors reported hearing the voices of those trapped inside the hull singing "There'll Always Be an England" as the ship made its final plunge. Rescue efforts began immediately, with nearby vessels moving in to pick up survivors despite the ongoing air attacks. The trawler Cambridgeshire alone rescued approximately 900 men. Other ships, small boats, and even makeshift rafts saved hundreds more. In total, approximately 2,477 people were rescued from the water. But between 3,500 and 5,800 perished. The exact number will never be known. The sinking of the Lancastria represented the greatest loss of life in British maritime history and the deadliest single incident for British forces during World War II. More British lives were lost in the sinking of the Lancastria than in the combined losses of the Titanic and Lusitania. Yet few people today are aware of this catastrophe. The reason for this historical amnesia lies in a decision made at the highest level of the British government. When news of the disaster reached London, Prime Minister Winston Churchill immediately suppressed it, invoking wartime censorship powers. With the fall of France imminent and British morale already at a low ebb, Churchill feared that news of such a catastrophic loss would further damage the national will to continue fighting. Churchill wrote in a memo, "The newspapers have got quite enough disaster for today, at least." The ban on reporting the Lancastria sinking was so complete that even Parliament was not informed. When the news was finally released, it was overshadowed by the French surrender to Germany, which occurred the same day. For the families of those lost, the censorship created additional anguish. Many received only vague notifications that their loved ones had died while on active service, with no mention of the Lancastria or the circumstances of death. Some families did not learn the full truth for years. The disaster had a profound effect on those who survived. Many suffered from what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. Survivors' guilt was common, especially among those who had lost friends or comrades. The unique horror of the oil-covered water and the strafing of survivors left psychological scars that never fully healed. Captain Sharp, who survived the sinking of his ship, returned to service only to lose his life 2 years later when another vessel under his command, the Laconia, was torpedoed in the South Atlantic. For him, as for so many others, the sea eventually claimed its due. The wreck of the Lancastria lies in approximately 20 meters of water in the Loire estuary. In 2006, the French government declared the site a war grave and designated it as a controlled archaeological site, protecting it from unauthorized disturbance. Despite efforts by survivors' associations, the British government has never designated the site as a war grave under UK law. Recognition of the disaster has been slow in coming. It was not until 2015, 75 years after the sinking, that a national memorial to the victims was established at the National Memorial Arboretum in Staffordshire, England. The Lancastria Association, formed by survivors and victims' families, continues to work for greater recognition of what remains Britain's worst maritime disaster and one of the most devastating single incidents in the country's military history. The story of the Lancastria reminds us that in the fog of war, even the greatest tragedies can be obscured by strategic necessity or overshadowed by the sheer scale of a global conflict. For the thousands who perished in the waters off Saint-Nazaire, recognition has been delayed but not denied. Their sacrifice now stands as a testament to the human cost of war and the quiet heroism of ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances. In the final days of World War II, as American forces prepared for the invasion of Japan, the heavy cruiser USS Indianapolis completed a secret mission of historic significance. On July 26, 1945, she delivered components of the first atomic bomb to the island of Tinian in the Marianas. The bomb, codenamed Little Boy, would be dropped on Hiroshima just days later, helping to bring the war to its conclusion. But for the crew of the Indianapolis, the war's end would come too late. After delivering her top-secret cargo, the Indianapolis was ordered to join U.S. forces gathering for the planned invasion of Japan. On July 30, 1945, while traveling unescorted from Guam to Leyte in the Philippines, the ship was spotted by Japanese submarine I-58, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto. At 12:14 a.m., Hashimoto fired a spread of 6 torpedoes. 2 struck the Indianapolis on her starboard side. The first torpedo blew away the bow of the ship. The second struck near midships, detonating in the vicinity of a powder magazine. The resulting explosion literally split the ship to the keel, knocking out all electrical power and causing the vessel to list sharply. Within 12 minutes, the Indianapolis rolled completely over and sank, taking roughly 300 of her 1,196-man crew down with her. The speed of the sinking and the loss of power prevented any distress signal from being sent. No one knew the Indianapolis had been attacked. No one knew her approximate position. No one knew that nearly 900 men were now floating in the Philippine Sea, most without lifeboats, many without life jackets. For the survivors, the ordeal was just beginning. The ship had sunk so quickly that only a few life rafts had been deployed. Most men were floating with just life jackets or clinging to debris. They organized themselves into groups, with the injured placed in the center, and stronger swimmers forming a protective ring around them. Initially, morale remained relatively high. The men expected to be missed and rescued quickly. But as the first day passed with no sign of rescue, the situation deteriorated rapidly. The men were exposed to the elements, baking in the tropical sun during the day and freezing in the night as their bodies cooled in the water. Dehydration set in quickly, made worse by the fact that many men, desperate for liquid, drank seawater. This only accelerated dehydration and, in many cases, led to hallucinations and psychosis. Then came perhaps the most notorious aspect of the Indianapolis tragedy, the sharks. The waters of the Philippine Sea are home to oceanic white-tip sharks and tiger sharks, both species known to be aggressive toward humans. The blood from initial injuries, the thrashing of men in the water, and the growing number of corpses attracted these predators in large numbers. Survivor Lowell Dean Cox later recalled, "Every now and then, like lightning, a shark would come straight up and take a sailor and take him straight down. One came up and took the sailor next to me. It was just somebody screaming, yelling, or getting bit." The shark attacks created a new level of terror among the survivors. Men tried to stay in tight groups, knowing that those who drifted away or were alone were most vulnerable. When someone died, their body would be pushed away from the group, in the hope that the sharks would focus on the dead rather than the living. Some groups formed a rotation system, with men on the outside taking turns moving to the relative safety of the center. As days passed without rescue, the situation became increasingly desperate. Exposure, dehydration, and saltwater poisoning took a heavier toll than the sharks. Men became delirious, fighting imaginary enemies or swimming away from the groups, convinced they saw islands or rescue ships in the distance. Some removed their life jackets and dove beneath the surface, believing they could find fresh water below. Others simply gave up hope and let themselves sink. The failure to rescue the men of the Indianapolis represents one of the most tragic breakdowns in naval communication and procedure in American history. Due to the secret nature of her mission, the Indianapolis had been sailing unescorted. More critically, a series of communication errors and procedural failures meant that her absence went unnoticed. The ship had been expected to arrive at Leyte on July 31st, but when she failed to appear, no alarm was raised. Incredibly, she had never been properly logged as overdue. Meanwhile, 3 distress signals had actually been sent by the sinking Indianapolis, but they were either not received or not acted upon due to procedural errors and skepticism about their authenticity. It was only by sheer chance that the survivors were spotted at all. On the afternoon of August 2nd, more than 3 days after the sinking, a U.S. Navy patrol plane on routine anti-submarine duty spotted an oil slick. Lieutenant Wilbur C. Gwynn, the pilot, decided to investigate and was shocked to discover men floating in the water. He immediately radioed for assistance and dropped life rafts and survival equipment. Another patrol aircraft, piloted by Lieutenant Adrian Marks, arrived shortly thereafter and made the extraordinary decision to land his seaplane on the open ocean, a dangerous maneuver for which the aircraft was not designed. Marks and his crew pulled 56 survivors from the water into the aircraft and stayed with the remaining survivors until ships arrived. The first rescue vessel, the USS Cecil J. Doyle, arrived after midnight on August 3rd, guided to the scene by the light of the aircraft's flares. The destroyer's captain, Lieutenant Commander W. Graham Claytor, Jr., took the unprecedented step of illuminating his ship with searchlights directed at the clouds, creating a beacon that gave hope to survivors still in the water and guided other rescue ships to the scene. Over the next day, ships rescued the remaining survivors. Of the approximately 900 men who had survived the initial sinking, only 316 were still alive when rescue finally came. The rest had succumbed to exposure, dehydration, saltwater poisoning, sharks, or their own despair. The aftermath of the Indianapolis tragedy was almost as controversial as the disaster itself. In an unprecedented move, the Navy court-martialed the ship's captain, Charles B. McVeigh III, charging him with hazarding his vessel by failing to zigzag, a defensive maneuver against submarine attack, and with failure to order abandoned ship in a timely manner. This despite the fact that McVeigh had not been informed of Japanese submarine activity along his route, and that even Commander Hashimoto, who was brought from Japan to testify, stated that zigzagging would not have saved the ship. McVeigh was convicted on the first charge, though his sentence was remitted. He remained in the Navy until his retirement in 1949, but was haunted by the disaster and the official blame placed upon him. For years after the war, he received hate mail from families of Indianapolis crewmen who had died. On November 6, 1968, using his Navy service revolver, McVeigh took his own life. He was found clutching a toy sailor in his hand. The injustice of McVeigh's court-martial became a cause célèbre among survivors of the Indianapolis and naval historians. In 2000, following years of effort by survivors and McVeigh's supporters, the United States Congress passed a resolution exonerating him. His record was amended to reflect that his conviction had been set aside. The wreck of the USS Indianapolis remained undiscovered for 72 years, despite numerous expeditions to locate it. Finally, in August 2017, a search team led by Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen located the wreckage 5,500 meters, 18,000 feet, below the surface of the Philippine Sea. The discovery brought a measure of closure to survivors and victims' families, though by then, only 19 survivors were still alive to witness it. Today, the story of the Indianapolis is remembered not only for the tragedy of its sinking and the horror of its aftermath, but also for the resilience of its survivors and their long fight for justice for their captain. The disaster led to significant changes in Navy procedures, including the implementation of a movement report system to prevent ships from disappearing without notice and the automatic search for any vessel overdue at its destination. For the men who survived those horrific days in the water, the experience never left them. Many suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder long before the condition was widely recognized. Reunions of survivors became important healing events, where men who had shared an unimaginable ordeal could find understanding that was available nowhere else. As survivor Richard Thielen, who was just 18 at the time of the sinking, reflected years later, "We went into the water as boys and came out as men, those of us who came out." His simple statement encapsulates the transformative nature of their ordeal and stands as a testament to human endurance in the face of circumstances beyond imagination. In the final months of World War II, as American submarines tightened their stranglehold on Japanese shipping, a unique agreement was reached between the warring nations. Japan would be permitted to use a single ship, marked with distinctive illuminated crosses, to transport Red Cross supplies to Allied prisoners of war held in Japanese camps. The ship would be granted safe passage through the blockade, its route and schedule communicated to American forces in advance. The vessel designated for this humanitarian mission was the MV Awa Maru, a 11,249-ton passenger cargo ship built in Japan in 1942. Under the terms of the agreement, the Awa Maru departed Japan on February 17, 1945, carrying Red Cross parcels, medicines, and relief supplies for Allied POWs and civilian internees in Japanese-occupied territories. The ship's route took it to Hong Kong, Singapore, and other ports in Southeast Asia, where it unloaded its humanitarian cargo. Having completed its delivery mission, the Awa Maru began its return journey to Japan in late March 1945. By this time, the vessel was no longer carrying Red Cross supplies. Instead, it had taken on approximately 2,000 passengers, including merchant seamen, diplomats, civilians, and technicians from Japanese-occupied territories who were returning to Japan. Many of these individuals were skilled workers whose expertise was desperately needed in the Japanese homeland as the war situation deteriorated. What happened next would become one of the war's most controversial incidents and lead to the only general court-martial of a U.S. submarine commander for actions against an enemy vessel during the conflict. On the night of April 1, 1945, the American submarine USS Queenfish, commanded by Commander Charles Elliott Laughlin, was patrolling in the Taiwan Strait. Visibility was poor due to rain and fog. At approximately 11 p.m., the submarine's radar detected a large ship traveling alone. Laughlin, believing he had encountered a Japanese destroyer, ordered an attack. The Queenfish fired a spread of torpedoes at the unidentified vessel. 4 torpedoes struck their target, and the ship sank rapidly. Only after the attack did Laughlin check his patrol orders more carefully and realize, to his horror, that he had likely sunk the Awa Maru, the very ship that had been guaranteed safe passage by the U.S. government. The sinking was catastrophic. Of the approximately 2,004 people aboard the Awa Maru, only one survived, a Japanese seaman named Kantaro Shimoda, who was remarkably experiencing his 3rd shipwreck survival. The rest perished in one of the war's deadliest single-ship disasters. The circumstances surrounding the sinking immediately raised difficult questions. The Awa Maru had been traveling exactly on its declared route and schedule. It was properly marked with illuminated white crosses on its sides, funnels, and deck, as required by the Safe Passage Agreement. It was running with full navigation lights in an area where all other vessels traveled blacked out. By all accounts, it should have been readily identifiable as the protected vessel it was. Yet Commander Laughlin had failed to properly identify his target before attacking. He had not been adequately briefed on the Awa Maru's expected passage through his patrol area. The submarine's communications officer had received messages about the Awa Maru's safe passage, but had not ensured that Laughlin was fully informed. The poor visibility that night further complicated the situation, making it difficult to visually confirm the target's identity. When news of the sinking reached American naval authorities, the reaction was swift and severe. Admiral Ernest J. King, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet, ordered Laughlin's immediate relief from command and return to the United States to face a general court-martial, the only such proceeding against a submarine commander during the war. The court-martial began in May 1945 at the Washington Navy Yard. Laughlin was charged with negligence and failure to obey orders. The proceedings revealed the complex circumstances surrounding the incident. Laughlin had indeed received general information about the Awamaru's safe passage, but had not been specifically notified that the ship would be passing through his patrol area on that particular night. The submarine's communications officer had failed to properly brief Laughlin on all relevant messages. Nevertheless, the court found Laughlin guilty of negligence for failing to take adequate steps to identify his target before attacking. He was issued a letter of reprimand that effectively ended his career advancement, though he remained in the Navy until his retirement in 1957. The diplomatic fallout from the sinking was significant. The Japanese government protested vehemently, accusing the United States of deliberately violating the Safe Passage Agreement. American authorities expressed deep regret and offered to replace the Awamaru with a similar vessel after the war. The incident strained the already limited diplomatic channels between the warring nations and complicated negotiations regarding the treatment of prisoners of war. After the war, as part of the 1949 peace treaty negotiations, Japan agreed to waive all claims against the United States arising from the sinking of the Awamaru in exchange for American economic assistance in rebuilding the country. The Japanese government assumed responsibility for compensating the families of those lost in the sinking. The Awamaru incident raises profound questions about the fog of war and the challenges of maintaining humanitarian agreements amid total conflict. Commander Laughlin was not a reckless officer intent on maximizing enemy casualties. He was a decorated submarine commander with an otherwise exemplary record. His failure that night was one of process and verification, a momentary lapse with catastrophic consequences. The incident also highlights the complex moral calculations of submarine warfare. American submariners operated under orders for unrestricted submarine warfare against Japanese shipping, a policy that mirrored Japan's own approach and was deemed necessary to cut off the resource-poor island nation from its conquered territories. In this context, the Awamaru's safe passage was an extraordinary exception to the rule of attack on sight. Adding another layer of complexity to the story are persistent rumors about the Awamaru's cargo on its return voyage. For decades after the war, stories circulated that the ship had been carrying vast quantities of gold, platinum, diamonds, and other treasures looted from Southeast Asia by retreating Japanese forces. Some accounts claim the cargo included 40 tons of gold, 12 tons of platinum, and 150,000 carats of diamonds, a treasure worth billions in today's values. These rumors were fueled by the Japanese government's unusual interest in the wreck site and by reports that the Chinese government, which controlled the waters where the Awamaru sank, had conducted extensive salvage operations in the 1970s and 1980s. However, declassified intelligence reports suggest a more nuanced truth. The Awamaru had indeed carried gold on its outward journey from Japan to Singapore, but this was part of a financial transaction with Thailand, which was providing logistical support to Japan. There is little credible evidence that the ship was carrying significant treasure on its return voyage when it was sunk. Another persistent legend claims that the Awamaru was carrying the fossil remains of Peking Man 1, of the most significant paleoanthropological discoveries of the 20th century, which disappeared during the chaos of World War II. While the fossils did indeed vanish during the Japanese occupation of China, and various theories suggest they were being transported to Japan. No conclusive evidence links them to the Awa Maru. In the 1980s, the People's Republic of China located the wreck of the Awa Maru in the Taiwan Strait and conducted salvage operations that reportedly cost $100 million. According to official statements, no treasure was found. The Chinese returned numerous artifacts and human remains to Japan, suggesting that whatever the ship's cargo might have been, it was not the fabulous treasure of legend. For the families of those lost aboard the Awa Maru, these controversies about hidden treasure are secondary to the human tragedy of the sinking. The 2,003 people who perished represented a cross-section of Japanese society and included many civilians whose only crime was being caught in the machinery of a war they had little power to influence. The Awa Maru incident stands as a sobering reminder of the challenges of maintaining humanitarian principles in the midst of total war. It demonstrates how easily miscommunication, human error, and the fog of war can undermine even the most carefully negotiated agreements. For Commander Laughlin, the sinking represented a personal tragedy as well, a single error that overshadowed an otherwise distinguished career and left him bearing the moral weight of 2,003 deaths. In the broader context of World War II's maritime disasters, the Awa Maru's sinking illustrates the war's complex moral landscape. Unlike the Wilhelm Gustloff or Lancastria, which were legitimate military targets despite their civilian passengers, the Awa Maru should have been spared under the specific agreement granting its safe passage. Its destruction represents not the calculated violence of war, but its tragic errors and unintended consequences. Today, the Awa Maru incident remains relatively obscure outside Japan and naval history circles. Yet it deserves remembrance not only for the scale of the human tragedy, but for the important questions it raises about responsibility, communication, and the maintenance of humanitarian principles, even in humanity's darkest hours. The sea has always been humanity's most unforgiving battlefield. During World War II, this ancient truth was magnified to unprecedented scale as the oceans became graveyards for thousands of vessels and hundreds of thousands of souls. The maritime disasters we've explored represent just a fraction of the war's toll at sea, yet each illuminates a different aspect of the conflict's human dimension. The Wilhelm Gustloff, with its cargo of desperate refugees, reminds us that civilians often bear the heaviest burden in total war. The Laconia incident reveals how humanitarian impulses can be crushed by the implacable logic of conflict. The Lancastria story shows how even the greatest tragedies can be obscured by strategic necessity. The Indianapolis demonstrates how bureaucratic failure can magnify natural dangers into catastrophe, and the Awa Maru illustrates the tragic consequences of miscommunication in the fog of war. These disasters claimed more than 20,000 lives combined, a number that exceeds the death toll of many famous land battles. Yet they remain relatively obscure in our collective memory of the war, overshadowed by strategic turning points and iconic moments of heroism or horror. Perhaps this is because maritime disasters lack the narrative clarity of battlefield engagements, or perhaps because the sea leaves no monuments to mark its claiming of human life. As the last survivors of these tragedies pass from the world, their stories risk fading into historical footnotes. Yet they deserve remembrance not only for the scale of human suffering they represent, but for the lessons they offer about the fragility of life, the complexity of warfare, and the enduring human capacity for both cruelty and compassion even in the darkest hours. The sea keeps its own counsel and tells its own truths. In its depths lie not only the physical remnants of these disasters, but also their unresolved questions and untold stories, a silent testament to war's true cost, measured not in territory gained or lost, but in human potential forever surrendered to the waves.